I see that?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dallas Emerson. I'm the Director of Business Development at the IT Guys. Joining me today is Mike Emerson. The last name is not a coincidence. We are father and son. Mike is joining us by audio only today, and he's here primarily for the Q&A period at the end. Mike is our CEO, and I begged and pleaded with him to join us for the Q&A period at the end, because there's so much detail that we can get into, there's so much we can cover, and I know so many people have such specific questions that what I wanted to have is that if there's an executive out there who needs a quick answer to something, we have an executive with experience in managing a virtual office, being Mike, who can quickly answer your questions. So I'm very appreciative of his time. So today we're talking about the virtual office and making the most of technology's changes during this kind of crazy time, during these interesting times. I think we're all familiar with that Chinese curse, the may you live in interesting times, and boy, do we live in interesting times today. It's been a wild ride for everybody I know. For me, it's very unusual to be talking about the virtual office during this time, because as Chelsea kind of mentioned at the beginning, we've been talking about this for years. And normally when we talk about working in a virtual environment, it's been theoretical, hypothetical, where we tell people, you can do everything from home. And we kind of got these responses over the years of going, yeah, sure. But now I'm doing this presentation to a conference full of people who are experts at working in a virtual environment. One thing I want to say up front is that what we're going to be talking about today is not just tech things. Yes, we are tech people. Our company is the IT Guys, and yes, we're mega nerds. But what we don't want this to be is the session where we just tell you, oh, here's a list of services, here's technology, go use that. We've launched a podcast series even called COVID Stories, where it's literally just us interviewing not-for-profit executives and figuring out what they're doing, how they're handling things. So a lot of what we're talking about today is not just our IT guy experience, it is not-for-profit leadership experience. Now, obviously filtered through a technology mindset, but we want to be bringing everything to you in the most de-jargoned version possible. So I think it's important that we open with this question: what is the virtual office? I'm a huge fan, by the way, of defining my terms. So you're going to find that throughout this session, I might be defining terms that you think, okay, come on, everybody knows that. And by the way, if it seems like I'm speaking quickly, if it seems like I'm moving quickly, we got a lot of ground to cover, and I want to make sure that we have as much time as possible at the end for questions and answers. So what is the virtual office? The virtual office is working seamlessly anywhere you need to. And if I could just highlight one of those words, it would be the seamlessly, because a lot of us had, before COVID-19, experience working outside the office, and during COVID-19, certainly we all have experience working from home now. But a lot of times we do things differently when we're working at home versus working in the office, or working, in the best of times, at a coffee shop versus working in the office. And so what we're talking about today is how to make sure that as much as possible, your work experience is the same regardless of where you are. So let's talk about what this session won't be. This session is not going to be a giant info dump. I'm not going to be sitting here reading off everything and just saying, okay, use this service, do this thing, talk to these people. I want this to, as much as possible, be tailored to leadership in a virtual environment, and I want there to be as much time as possible for questions and answers at the end. This session is not tech speak only, so we're not just going to be talking about the technology aspect, and I hope I don't leave anybody behind. I try as much as possible to make sure that we're not using overly techy terms. And this session is not to be used only during shelter in place. This is one of the most important things I think I can tell you, is that what we're talking about today works during the best of times as well, or if not better than during these hard times we're currently in. And I think that's kind of what this session is going to be a lot about, is improvisation versus planning. A lot of organizations, and I give you so much credit if you are one of those organizations that was not ready for this and you have made the transition to working in a virtual environment. But a lot of organizations have improv their way through, and they've kind of dealt with things as they come. One thing that Mike and I talk a lot about is the tyranny of the now. So many nonprofit organizations are dominated by that concept. One moment. Of saying, I have a problem right now, and I need to solve that problem right now. And there's nothing wrong with solving a problem as it happens. But what we want to do is help organizations be able to plan to work more effectively in a virtual environment. Texas is kind of cautiously reopening right now. I know here in Austin, it's going a little bit slower than maybe in more rural areas. So what we want to do is try to help organizations that as things begin to reach a new normal, I don't like that term, but it's what we have, that we kind of have the steps in place, or the ideas in place on what steps to take. So what we're talking about today, you may hear something and you go, well, we're already doing A, B, or C, but this is also for how to best do A, B, or C when we are transitioning back. Maybe that'll make a little bit more sense as we move forward. So I want to tell you a little bit about our story, and I don't mean I'm going to go all the way back and say, well, Mike was a young man when he founded our company. No, what I mean is that we are a virtual company ourselves. Everybody works from home all the time, but we weren't always that way. Many years ago, we did have an office, and it was an awesome office. We were South Austin. We had receptionists. It was beautiful. But that office came with a lot of expenses because, as it turns out, they expect you to pay rent and utilities, and you have to pay those receptionists. And we had to ask ourselves, what was this all about? Was it to feel good about ourselves? And I say that because we're in the IT service industry. Well, our techs should all be out doing tech things, or ideally doing work remotely, logging into computers remotely, and they could do that from home. Why would they want to come to an office to just log in remotely, or come to an office and then leave so they can go to another office? Our salespeople are either making phone calls or sending emails or visiting offices. So why do they need to come into the office? And so it was kind of this realization at one point that we had of going, well, maybe we should just go home. And I say one day we went home. There was a lot of planning that went in behind it, a lot of thought process of where's our information going to live. But everything kept going. We found out, we were able to do our job working from home. And so I say this very brief, very quick story, not to say, hey, look at the IT guys, we're so great and smart, we were ahead of the curve on this one, but to say that during the best of times, even, we can look at our operations and say, why are we doing things the way we do? And so I think it's important that we ask, why do we work how we do, or rather how we did before COVID-19? Why do we go to the office? And that maybe sounds crazy to ask, because again, I want everybody to be thinking about working virtually, not just during COVID-19, but also after COVID-19. Obviously, there's going to be a long period of social distancing. And for many of you, you may discover, much like the IT guys, things have worked pretty well with nobody actually in an office. So how do we keep this thing going? How do we make sure that we're doing this to the best degree possible? And I think it's important to ask, why do we have offices? Why do we work how we do now? It's important to know why things are the way they are today. So that way, if you're changing something, you're not changing it for the worse. I think it's best illustrated by a very short story, I believe, by C.S. Lewis. It tells the story of a young man who walks to work every day. And every day he crosses through a field. And every day in this field, he has to hop a gate. And it's this old, rusty gate. And he tells himself, one day I'm just going to open this gate. It's stupid that I have to hop it every day. I never see anybody use it. So one day he does. He opens the gate. He brings a bolt cutter's lock, takes the lock off, goes to work, and he is proud of himself. I have changed the world for the better, he says. And then when he leaves work, there's sheep all in the streets. And somebody comes up to him and says, can you believe someone opened that gate? And so the important concept here that I want to get across is that when we're talking about making these transitions, again, not just during COVID-19, but during the best of times, we understand that maybe that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that we don't want to just change things because we can, but that we're changing things because we should. So the answer to this question of why do we work how we did before all this, and how we do normally, is we go where the work is. And what I mean by that is that work needed physical infrastructure. You know, the modern office concept grew out of the Industrial Revolution. I'm pretty sure no one was expecting the Industrial Revolution to be cited during a discussion about COVID-19 virtual office work. But, you know, for the longest time, working from home was just how everybody did it. But then we needed physical infrastructure. We needed the machinery to make things in factories. And then we transitioned away from being an industrial economy, and we worked toward offices that had typewriters and they had filing cabinets. And then those evolved into mainframes and dummy terminals that you logged into. And eventually it was servers and PCs. But there was always something in the office you had to go to. But recently we've developed, and I say we, very, very smart people have developed cloud-based infrastructure that allow us to work really wherever we want to, as long as we have an internet connection. And so when we talk about working virtually during the best of times, it's not just because we think it's a good idea, but because there has been a change in our capabilities. And obviously now, a change in our needs. So during this time, many of you are going to be discovering that offices are almost completely unnecessary, that you're going to look around and think to yourself, you know, things have been working relatively smoothly. For others, you're going to find out that maybe your office space needs can be adjusted, where you're going to say, okay, maybe you're an organization that does regular trainings, or you need a physical location because you're a food bank, or you're leading a homeless shelter. You know, you need physical infrastructure. But you might actually be able to adjust your office needs still, because maybe you don't need all of your staff in the office all of the time. So it's one of the first things I would encourage you to look at is during this time when everybody is working from home, really try to judge how much you need for that physical infrastructure. And what I want to say first off is that the virtual office isn't exclusive. Sometimes when I talk to people about transitioning to entirely cloud-based infrastructure, they say, but well, you know, we have this server that we're using, or we have a really nice office and I don't want to do that. You can work in a fully virtualized environment, in a totally cloud-based environment, but still in the office. And we've all, well, maybe you've seen it. I've seen the numbers that Mission Capital has put out from their Pulse surveys. There's some pretty disturbing information coming out about operating capital and about the willingness right now for businesses and individuals to donate. And so if organizations can cut back in any way on their office space needs, if they can reduce that overhead during these difficult times, that's going to be such a game changer. And even during the best of times, I know so many organizations are held to that totally unrealistic overhead ratio where people are asking, well, how much are you spending on overhead? How much are you spending on operations? Well, if we can reduce, or on your programs, if we can reduce your need for office space, if we can cut that back, that could be a game changer. And so what we're talking about today too, the 3 big challenges of the virtual office. The first being technology. Now, I think this is something a lot of people are solving kind of as the problems come up. That's one of the big reasons why Zoom has taken off, because it was a free, easy to use virtual conferencing system that was adopted, but for a lot of you, maybe it wasn't the best choice, but it was a choice that you were able to quickly adapt. And there's been a lot of things like that, people rapidly bringing on an instant messaging system that maybe they weren't familiar with or doesn't gel super well with your other services, but that's what you learn to use. And so we kind of want to talk about the steps you need to take to make sure everything is playing together. Mindset. This is a particularly challenging aspect. I know when I talk to people, technology tends to be the thing that they're more scared of, where they say, well, I'm not very tech savvy. I have great news for you. You're more tech savvy than you think. If you're on this call, if you're listening to this being recorded, you're more tech savvy than you think. We live in an era that has trained us to readily adapt to technology changes. I'll have somebody who will send me an email saying, well, I need some help with this, and I'm not very tech savvy. Of course, they send this email from their new cell phone that just got a software update using an app that just got an update. We've been trained because of the constant changes in technology to adapt pretty readily. So my encouragement to you is that the technology side of things is actually easier to learn. There's also a right or wrong when it comes to technology. You can find services that work or they don't. Mindset is a lot of gray area where you have to figure out what works best for your organization. And the third challenge is intentionality. Now, intentionality in many ways can be considered a subset of mindset, but we're going to get into it that it really needs to be its own discussion. So let's just define technology really quick. That's the stuff you use, both physical and virtual. Those are your computers, your phones, that's Zoom, Slack maybe. That is the services you're taking advantage of. Mindset is how you're using it and what you're doing while you're using it. And intentionality is how you're going to be keeping up with everyone and everything. Now, intentionality, like I said, is super important. So we're going to just sit on this slide, on this topic for a second, because during lockdown, obviously, we're all experiencing kind of that stress of not being able to be in communication with each other or being in regular communication. But during the best of times too, working in a virtualized environment takes a lot of additional effort. And as the leaders of organizations in a virtual environment, it takes a lot of intentionality. Nonprofit leadership tends to be extremely emotionally intelligent, which makes a lot of sense. Most nonprofit leadership is led by people who care about people. So if you're listening to this, you're probably a people person, maybe not an extrovert, but you really like other people. And the distance that social distancing creates, the distance that a virtualized office creates, makes it very difficult to lead. You can no longer just bump into somebody while getting coffee or just walk into somebody's office and see how they're doing. Everything takes a little bit more effort. You have to plan out when you're going to talk to people. The biggest part of intentionality is communicating intentionally. There's so much informality in the office where you can just say, oh, by the way, I had this idea. Where now you have to actually think about how you're going to do this. So one of the things I want to talk about with communicating intentionally is something I learned from another executive. She leads a small organization, but she uses Slack, an instant messaging system. Now, I know what you're thinking to yourself, oh, great, another millennial talking about Slack. Yes, I know. But instant messaging systems can be more than just a way to send funny memes. What she does is she wakes up before her staff every morning. She logs into her Slack account every morning before everybody else does, and she waits to see all of her staff sign in. Not as a way of saying, okay, who's working right now? When are they actually starting their day? But so that way she can start a conversation with everybody that day, see how they're doing. What did you do last night? How did you blow off some steam? Just as a way of reaching out and letting everybody know individually she cares about them and she's thinking about them. Now, if you're in an organization of 50, 60, 100 people, maybe that isn't realistic. But for smaller organizations, that intentional leadership at the very beginning of the day can be a game changer. Setting up times where you're going to talk to people is huge, and encouraging your staff, encouraging your teammates to communicate intentionally, particularly to those introverts. I know a lot of people out there are thinking, well, the introverts are loving this social distancing time. They're loving working in a virtualized environment. They're also the least likely to say that something has gone wrong. So reaching out and saying, hey, is everything okay, is super important. And again, encouraging not just the leadership of your organization, but everybody in your organization to kind of be checking in on each other is huge during this time. It's also important, I think, during this time to kind of have a pyramid of communications. It's kind of least detailed / urgent to most detailed and urgent. Instant messaging is great for non-urgent, not very detailed things where you're just asking questions like, how you doing? Or, hey, what time was that call tomorrow? I don't have it on my calendar. Emails, I think, are great for having very detailed, but not super urgent, where you're saying, okay, we need to get all this covered. So here's topics 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then phone calls are great for, I need to immediately get all the details right now. Now, it may seem silly, me talking about what you should use different communication tech for. But I've worked, Mike has worked, our whole organization has worked in a virtual environment for a long time. I think we all understand the inherent benefit of cutting down on email clutter, right? People stop reading emails after a certain point. But it's important, I think, to kind of have an established practice in every organization about what we're using what tools for, because we have all these different things that we can communicate with. And during this time, it's going to be really easy to get overwhelmed with one kind of communication or another. It's important to set boundaries. People love, at an inherent level, we thrive when we have healthy boundaries set up, right? I'm reminded of a story that a teacher told me. He grew up in central Canada, which is basically the Great Plains, and their schoolyard didn't have fences around where the kids would have recess. And he said it was almost frightening that you couldn't really see anything, any boundaries. It was just the world went out into the distance, into the horizon. And he said that the kids tended to kind of cluster around the schoolyard, setting up these communication, I don't want to say barriers, but these structures where you say, all right, here's what we're using this for, here's what we're using phones for, here's what we're using video chats for, is going to really make communication smooth. And it's going to help people feel more comfortable in this time. Just as you wouldn't just pop into somebody's office to have an hour-long conversation, you'd want to set up a meeting. You don't necessarily just want to call someone to tell them about the funny thing your dog just did. Okay, I think I've sat on intentionality long enough. Let's move on. So I had said there's the 3 challenges. Well, these are the 3 necessities and how you're going to be approaching these challenges. There's security, accessibility, and mobility. So security is keeping yourself, your stuff, and your organization safe, particularly from cybercrime. During this time, cybercrime is actually on the rise, according to some statistics, particularly spear phishing, because everybody's outside the office and we're getting barraged with emails. Criminals are betting that you and your staff are not paying attention. Accessibility. This is getting to your information. It's collaborating and it's training easily. Hiring and firing during this time is something that I think is very scary. Bringing new people on board needs to be as easy as possible. Your methods, your operations need to be easily accessible to people. And last but not least, mobility. This is for when we can start going back to the office. I know a lot of organizations are thinking about kind of establishing staggered rules or phased in reopening where they're saying, okay, a certain number of staff are allowed in the office for a certain number of days a week. So making sure that your staff can work on the move, on the go, in your office, outside the office is going to be huge. So let's talk about the technology needs, or the security needs for technology. The first thing you're going to need is a reputable cloud storage solution. Maybe you're an organization who's been in the cloud for a long time. Maybe you're using a VPN to get to your server, or maybe you're just using, maybe everybody's just saving all their data to their personal computers. Here's what I have to say. You're going to want a reputable cloud storage solution. VPNs, not that great. Servers are expensive to maintain. They're difficult to maintain. And VPNs, when we can actually start going places, are pretty cantankerous. A lot of hotels, public venues actually close the ports that your computer will use to access that server because they don't know what you're getting to. You want to go to a cloud storage solution that uses the same protocols as getting to any other website. That way you can get to it wherever you go. You're also going to want it because, frankly speaking, the cloud is just safer than a server. Frankly speaking, Microsoft, Google, Box.com, Dropbox, these organizations have billions of dollars to spend on securing your information. And if you're a nonprofit, you probably don't have billions of dollars to spend securing your information. Now, when I say reputable cloud storage, there's a lot of different cloud solutions out there. There's tons. It seems like everybody who has access to a computer and the internet wants to launch their own cloud service. Here's what I recommend. You want something that you pay for, or you're getting maybe free through TechSoup, because I think it's G Suite is available for free through TechSoup. But something that has a paid for plan that you're using that plan. Because the free versions of things just aren't good. And if something goes wrong, you are not that company's priority. So I recommend going with Microsoft's Office 365 or SharePoint through Office 365, which is now being rebranded as Microsoft 365, or G Suite, Box.com, or Dropbox. And again, the paid for version of Dropbox. I know we all want to be good stewards of our money, but frankly, trying to get a lot of different free things to work together just is not going to work in the long run. On G Suite, I hear great things about it. I don't use it personally. I will say that Google has a problem with corporate responsibility, in my experience, where they've said things along the lines of, well, we don't data mine, we don't read your emails, we're not looking at where you're going when you use Google Maps. And the fact is, they did do all those things. And it wouldn't be so bad if they hadn't, but they said they weren't doing those things, and then it turns around they did. So I have a little bit of a hard time building trust with Google. But again, for a lot of people, it's working great. You're going to want a remote management system. The backbone from a technology perspective, the modern office, is that server that people log into, that, sorry about that noise, that make sure that that you're logging in, that you are a verified member of the organization, that you're getting the information you should be getting to and not more information. It keeps your organization secure. Well, in a virtual environment, in a cloud-based environment, you don't have access to that kind of information, or you don't have access to that kind of capability, I should say. And so setting up something that allows you to have your staff log in, that they have to securely log into their computers, make sure that your staff and your organization are going to be safe. You're going to want to have a robust antivirus. Again, something you pay for, because free antiviruses are worth every penny. You're going to want to have an anti-spam. Now, ironically enough, here, I say you probably should get a paid-for version, but a lot of the high-quality email providers, again, Office 365, Gmail, have very robust and increasingly robust anti-spam systems. So if there's anything you're going to not necessarily pay for, it would be the anti-spam. I've seen some organizations that have way over-provisioned when it comes to their anti-spam, where they have a physical device on premises. If your organization has fewer than 100 people working there, or really fewer than 200, you don't need a physical spam filter. You just need a service you subscribe to. You need modern equipment and operating systems. Again, I know we're all trying to be good stewards, but as much as possible, we need to maintain up-to-date operating systems. If you're operating using Windows 7, for example, your computer and your staff, your organization is at risk, because outdated operating systems are security threats. They're no longer receiving security updates. They're no longer the priority of the provider. And the longer they are outdated, the more and more they can be exploited by cyber criminals. I have seen some people who use Windows XP on their security systems. If they have their own building and they need to lock the doors, I've seen the most outdated operating system imaginable right now running those computers that are keeping them safe. So my number one message to you is, if nothing else, keep your computers up to date. Mindset, the security mindset. Everything in your organization needs to be, your information organization needs to be permissions based. You want to make sure that people are accessing the information that they want access to in a cloud-based environment, but not making everything a free-for-all. So making sure that finance staff can only access finance information. You don't want everything to be available to everybody. You don't want it to be on the honor system. We need to be training our staffs, again, particularly against cybercrime, particularly against spear phishing, which is the fastest growing cybercrime that's happening right now. So making sure that your staff are being trained regularly in a virtual environment is huge, because you can't just have people pop into an office. And I've got to pick up the pace here. I'm realizing that I need to go a little bit more quickly. So the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to security mindset is workstations versus personal devices. When everybody was working in an office, it was really easy to say, okay, this computer is a work device. You're not allowed to access maybe social media, Spotify. You're not allowed to download games. You're not allowed to get to adult-oriented content. You're not allowed to go on dating websites. The problem, particularly that COVID-19 presents, is maybe that work device is their number one connection to the outside world. And so, and this is where it's very gray area. It may be best, maybe, to allow staff to be able to download Netflix onto their work devices, so that way, when they're not working, they have something to blow off steam. Again, that's a discussion that you need to have with the leadership of your organization. I can't tell you what the right decision for your organization is, but now more than usual, it's actual gray area instead of just being, yeah, it's a work device, just use it for work. Just use it for work. Accessibility. Again, you're going to want a reliable cloud storage solution here. Something that is well known, something that is, when I say reliable, doesn't have regular outages, for example. So again, that's SharePoint through Office 365. And I realize Chelsea and other Mission Capital people who may be listening to this know I used to hate SharePoint a few years ago. They've really turned things around. By the way, when I say things like you should use SharePoint or Box.com, I'm not getting a kickback. I'm not getting paid by any of these companies to give them any advertising. These are the things that we recommend just because they're the best that we see. So again, SharePoint through Office 365. If you want to use G Suite, Dropbox for Business, or Box.com. You're going to want to make sure that your staff all have decent internet. Again, this is one of those interesting things that COVID-19 has presented, is when everybody's working from home, we need to make sure our staff have quality internet connections. Now, if you're in a major metroplex, that might be pretty easy and affordable. If not, you may, well, regardless, you may want to look into subsidizing your staff's internet connection. And if you're looking at maybe all or going permanently virtual, that's a lot cheaper than having an office space. And we're more and more going to want to move toward having voice over IP phone systems with cloud PBX. You don't want to have physical infrastructure in the office. You don't want to have a server that's running your phone system. You want it to be cloud-based. That way it can work the same way regardless of where you are. Seamless, seamless, seamless. Any steps that we can take out of the process of somebody working from home, that way they're not sitting there going, wait, in the office I do it this way, but at home I do it this way. We want to take those steps out. So as we're transitioning toward a calmer world, when we can actually, focus on planning for tomorrow rather than just surviving today, transitioning to a reliable cloud service, making sure that all of our staff have decent internet connection, and making sure that we're using a voice over IP system is huge. Now, the mindset behind accessibility, we want to make sure that information is easily shared. What you don't want to have is your staff sending a bunch of attachments where everybody's saving a different version of the same file. We want to have one version of the truth, one version. You don't want to have duplicate, triplicate, quadruplicate versions of things running around out there. That will lead to confusion, and it will lead to lots of problems later on down the line of trying to figure out, well, wait, which one is the real version? So you want to have your information easily shared and easily work together on. All those services that I talked about, Dropbox for Business, OneDrive / SharePoint, G Suite, Box.com, they all have the ability to just share a link to that file. That way people can update the same file rather than working on a version on their computer, then re-uploading it. You want to make sure that your information is shared in a job-focused, not person-focused way. Now, what I mean is that your folders, you don't have, for example, a Tammy folder anymore, or a Dallas folder, a Mike folder, a Chelsea folder, that you have a business development folder, or a fundraising folder, a finance folder, an executive folder. Because it's going to make it a lot easier if you need to hire somebody on, add somebody new to a group, rather than saying, okay, here's this person, and now we're going to make sure that they have access to all these different folders. You just say, oh, we're going to put you in the executive group, and boom, you have you have access to all the folders and files that the executive has access to. We also want to move away. This is a pet peeve of mine, but I think particularly for nonprofits who are people focused, this needs to be a priority to a degree. We need to move away from naming folders after people, because what happens when that person leaves? Well, almost inevitably, we don't change the name of the folder. And so you'll have Bruce working in the Laura folder. And it's a little thing, but it is kind of dehumanizing for Bruce after a while. I say this because we saw somebody who was working in, and I don't remember the exact name, but let's just say it was the Victoria folder. And his name was not Victoria, nor was his predecessors, nor was her predecessors. He was the 4th generation Victoria. And it's a little thing, but it makes the worker who's stuck working in a file that is not their own, or folder that is not their own, feel like the organization, A, doesn't really care to update it, B, it makes them wonder, well, how long am I going to be around here? And C, it kind of makes them feel like the organization doesn't have their stuff together. So we want to make folders accessed on a job-focused approach rather than a person-focused. And we want to make sure that things are easily collaborative. I think we all are all familiar with working in Google Docs, being able to simultaneously edit. Office 365 has the same feature. Box.com has a similar feature where you can have multiple people working on the same folder. Because again, right now, nobody's hunching around the same laptop saying, oh, wait, there should be a comment there. And even going down the road, when things start to reopen, you're not going to be able to do that in the same office. I think we're going to be in a social distancing mindset for many months, if not a year or more. So making sure that you have a service that allows you to easily collaborate on a folder simultaneously is huge. Mobility mindset. Again, you're going to need a cloud service that's going to empower you to work the same way no matter where you are. We don't want to have VPNs. We don't want to have a different process for working outside the organization that we do working inside the organization. And you're going to want to have kind of mobile or portable devices. I know a lot of you have, well, I've seen this quite a bit in the past, where there's a board rule or an auditing rule that, for example, the finance director needs to have a desktop computer, that he or she cannot work on a mobile device. So what I recommend to get around that little thing is a miniature desktop. That little device I hold up right there is called a NUC, a Next Unit of Computing. I call it a portable device because, yeah, you can't use it while moving around, but you can easily put it in a purse, take it home, and plug it into a monitor and keyboard there. The finance director for Big Brothers Big Sisters of Central Texas, for example, does that. So we want to make our computers as mobile as possible. We want to make our staff as mobile as possible. And our mindset here, really, it's what we're all experiencing right now, is where do we want to work? When we start to reintroduce the ability to work in the offices, there's going to be some staff who don't feel comfortable. So making sure that they have the ability to work at home with the same efficiency that people work in the office is going to be key. We want to be able to ask the question, where's the best way or the best place to do this task? So when we can start seeing people again, we want to ask, is this task best done in person, or should we do this over the phone? And having the ability to do that seamlessly is super important. It's going to make life a lot easier. And this is something, the last point here is the work-life balance. And I know this is something that we're all trying to figure out, and this is all gray area again. Being able to communicate to your staff, okay, it's okay to stop working at these times, is really important. I was speaking with someone yesterday who said she doesn't know when it's okay to turn off her computer. Her whole apartment has become her office. As leaders, it's important to set an example to say, okay, this is still, you still need to have a life after work, take some time. And also saying, okay, you're not getting paid for working 12 hours a day. might be an important way toward. I know there's some people out there who are worried that their staff aren't actually working a full workday. And part of that may be the fear, again, not having boundaries. By setting those boundaries, you may find, in fact, I'm certain you will find your staff are more effective. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is disaster recovery versus operational continuity. What COVID-19 has taught us is that most of our disaster recovery plans were overrated and or outdated. We were looking at it from a single event perspective, where we're thinking, if you're in the Central Texas area, about a flood, about a wildfire, a singular event that you abandon ship and then you kind of put the pieces back together. What COVID-19 has faced us with is a rolling disaster where we don't really have a firm date. I mean, how many times have the social distancing rules been extended, for example? So what the virtual office empowers us to do when everything is cloud-based, when we've removed our need for physical infrastructure, what that's done is given us the ability to work through the disaster. We have operational continuity, and down the road, that's where everything is going to be. We want to be able, and I'm not saying if your apartment is on fire, keep working. By all means, get out of the apartment. But operational continuity gives us the ability to work through disasters. So the last thing I want to leave you with is the idea that the virtual office isn't disruptive. It doesn't mean that you have to leave your office. It doesn't mean that you have to change everything that you do. But it defeats disruption by giving us the ability to quickly adapt to changes. Okay, that's 41 minutes. We have a little bit of time here for questions. Let's go. Mike, you can unmute your microphone now. Chelsea, are you going to be managing the questions, or do you want me to look through the chat?
Yeah, I think I'm happy to help out. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to increase on. I feel like you did a really great job going into detail on a lot of things. So no questions yet, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat now.
Yes, and my apologies to anybody who feels like maybe we've rushed through this, but there's just so much to cover. There's so many things. If you have very specific questions that you say, okay, well, this is our particular position, you have my email address there.
Mm-hmm.
Send me an email. Let's set up a time to discuss your questions. I'm more than happy to cover it. Chelsea, you've seen this session now a couple of times. Are there things that you feel like we hit on more before that you'd like us to clarify a little bit while we're here?
Kind of in the opposite, this something that's really stuck out to me is the intentionality part, and how much that has really reemphasized over during our remote working sessions, because I think we felt like we had a lot of tools and options, but understanding what people needed to do and getting that agreement between leadership and program staff, that maybe we don't send quick pictures of your dog via email, but that might be a Teams chat, that type of thing, has been a really interesting one. I wonder if you can kind of speak to what are the challenges you've seen from the clients that you've worked with before in this transition to complete virtual work. Has anything come up for the people who maybe were, quote, more prepared for this or thinking already about some of these challenges, but what have kind of been the things that have sustained?
Yes, so interestingly enough, most of our clients are already in cloud-based environments. A lot of the organizations I've talked to were already thinking about transitioning. So in some ways, this has accelerated a lot of changes.
Mm-hmm.
The challenges that we see coming up, and this is mostly from a leadership perspective again, is the loss of that person-to-person emotional connection. The inability to feel when somebody is going through a hard time. Would you agree, Mike? We've spoken to people like Tricia Hall or Brent Fields, who said that they just can't tell when something is going wrong.
And for sure. I think one of the other big challenges is realizing that not everyone adapts to this equally.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who thrive in this environment, excuse me, and those that don't. And one of the challenges of moving to a virtual office is understanding who those people are and helping them cope, especially the people that feel like they miss the social interaction that they normally have. that just thrive on that. How do you help those people? A lot of it boils down to kind of a mental health issue more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are some people who can never make the transition from the structure of an office to the sort of unstructured home environment. They don't know where the boundaries are. They have a hard time with that. Or the lure of watching TV is too much, and they end up watching TV instead of working, and they can't get stuff done. The other extreme is people that work and work and work, and they look up and it's dark, and the kids and family have all gone to bed, and they're still working, and they never realized it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so, unfortunately, what happens, an unfortunate byproduct of moving to a virtual office, is sometimes your personnel will change. There are some people that just won't be able to go there with you, and you have to accept that. Some people just can't do it, don't want to do it, and others thrive on it. And so over time, you build up an office, quote, office staff of people who are really mentally, emotionally, and work ethically equipped to do this. So you can tell everybody go home and work, but that doesn't mean that they're all going to want to do it for a long period of time. The COVID thing is an odd situation. It was thrust on us. But if you're going to do this long term, the word intentionality keeps coming up. That has to be taken into consideration, that your staff makeup will probably change.
Yeah.
And I think another thing that I've heard, and I think the words were, "Oh my God, what am I going to do when I have to hire somebody?" How are they supposed to bring a new person onto the team, particularly in smaller organization where it's really tight knit? How are they supposed to do that? And so, one thing that I've recommended, it kind of almost sounds crazy, is to don't have just one person in charge of training that new person.
Mm-hmm.
Have a couple of different people who handle different aspects of the training, because what that's going to do is that new person is going to have a chance to talk with a couple of different people. They're going to feel like they know a few people at the organization. B, it's going to give them a couple of different perspectives into how the organization works. And so I think it's really important to, if you're a smaller organization, try to involve a couple of people in onboarding a new person.
And that's a good point too. When we all went home for COVID, we all went home with our own corporate culture still intact. We know who we worked for, who we worked with. That had already kind of been instilled in us from the beginning. Which, when you bring someone in from the outside who hasn't had that corporate culture in filling that everyone normally gets, do they ever get it? How do you make sure they get it? How do they become part of the team? To use an overworked word, and then the other word comes back into play, which is intentionality. Looking at the virtual office as a longer term thing than what we're doing with shelter in place. A lot of people are talking about downsizing their office. They realize they don't need the big office that they have, or using a co-location workplace like WeWork or something like that, because it's what they want to do still is have a regular get together time where the whole staff can get together and form that culture that they might not otherwise have, to see people besides a little box on their screen and see that there's a real person there. So to me, there's the two big things are technology, which is really pretty easy, and intentionality, which is not. It takes a lot more thought, and it's more people oriented. And I sometimes struggle with that part of things. Technology I can handle. It's people I have a problem with sometimes. And it just takes a lot more work. And to me, all the struggles and all the challenges with virtual officing, the people aspect of it, the intentionality aspect of managing people, takes on a different dimension that we don't always think about. We just kind of do it. You walk down the hall. Oh, hey, Bob. Oh, let me tell you about such and such. And you get off of these conversations from which great ideas can come. Well, now all of a sudden you have to virtually walk down that hall and make a point of talking to Bob about whatever it was you want to talk about. And that's an ongoing challenge. To me, that's the biggest challenge.
What about, I think this is a good transition to a question we've got about when you're in a hybrid environment where some staff are virtual and some are in the office. Do you guys have any recommendations for managing that, or thinking through what that might look like, or what recommendations you'd have for that?
That presents a couple of interesting difficulties. From a technology standpoint, again, if everything is in the cloud, if you've planned for this kind of situation, from a technology standpoint, it's going to be easy. The hard part is trying to make sure that those people who are working at home still feel like they're part of the organization, particularly when those people who are in the office have all that time to bond, right? You want to try to establish a unified corporate culture. And so over at the Texas Society of Association Executives, for example, I know they're doing weekly happy hours. The only rule is they're not allowed to talk about work, and they're not allowed to dress business in business clothing. They have to wear T-shirts. Those are the two rules they have. And so setting up times where your staff, both virtual and physical staff, can come in and get to know a little bit about each other is huge.
I think also the why people are working at home is important to know how you're going to work with them. Are they working at home because they live an hour, 2 hours away and it just works better that way? Or what? Because ultimately, I think the best thing to do is have a rotating in-office, out-of-office staff. So that what happens is you don't end up with cliquishness where you have the in-office guys and everybody else. So you have kind of us and us versus them mentality, where the people outside always feel like they don't quite fit with everybody else. But if you can keep them rotating in and out, maybe you have a staff of 10 and you have 4 workspaces, so every day there's 4 people there, but it's a different 4 people all the time. And it's a different mix of people. So it's not always the same 4 in, always the same 4 out. The idea is to create this homogenous working group that doesn't feel like there's a wall between them or any kind of we're back to high school again with cliques,
Right.
which God knows I don't want to do that. So I think that's a huge thing, is to prevent those barriers from being formed. And they will form naturally if you don't go out of our way, again, intentionally, to make sure they don't.
Well, and it sounds like, Mike, you're really talking about like building empathy with other people's situations, right? Understanding what their reality is, and then how can we cross-train and cross-expose to make sure that people are understanding of those.
Right.
I also have another question from the chat about managing an overwhelming number of services needed and used. How do you find efficiencies or streamline the number of services? I'm sure, especially as we're all adjusting, and I know we had it in our office where it was like, oh, we could use this or this or that. Any thoughts on how to kind of think of that from a management perspective?
Well, I think management has to just decree what's going to be used in each category of tool. Because yes, there's a million ways to do things now. Everyone out there is creating, and there's going to be more. The whole COVID shelter at home setup is going to generate more Zooms, more Slacks. Everyone wants to be, get in on that action. Well, the problem is, at a certain point, management has to say, okay, yeah, there's a million ways to do instant messaging, but we're going to use this one. Or there's a million video chat apps out there, but we're going to use this one. That way, you end up with this plethora, this proliferation of services that don't always get along, or everyone has to learn so many different ways to do it. So I think you have to just standardize. That's the big thing. We discovered early on, and we've gone through several different communications methods within our own organization. We started with Skype, which nobody liked. We moved to Slack, which everybody liked. And now we moved to Teams, which everybody likes even more. But we did it together. So we don't have some people using Skype, some people using Slack, and some people using Teams. We made the decision, this is what we're using. Everybody get on board. If you don't like it, I'm sorry, but everybody else likes it. And that's how we got to do it.
Well, and I'm reminded too, I mentioned earlier that we had been interviewing nonprofit leaders. I was speaking to the Associated Builders and Contractors director, Tracy Littlefield. And her number one piece of advice to leaders right now is be decisive. And if you can't be decisive, appear decisive. And I think here's the great news about all these services. They're commoditized. To a degree, there's very few differences, for example, between Microsoft Teams and Slack. And so choosing one makes that one better, right? So obviously there are some wrong choices. You don't want to be using some instant messenger that is terrible. But at a certain point, when you get to a certain level of quality, it's just a matter of choosing one. And so that was her number one advice. Speaking of COVID stories, to anybody out there, I'd love to hear your COVID story. So if you could send me an email, I would love to have a chance to chat with you about it, because what we're trying to do is understand everything that's going on in the not-for-profit world, particularly in Central Texas in this time. So that's my one request to you. If you think you don't have anything to add, I guarantee you do.
I think one last bit of advice I would have for folks is that, Dallas, you talked about different methods of communication, phone and chat, email, is when you're going to communicate information to someone, to kind of mentally triage in your mind, what's the persistence of that information you're conveying? If it's just a one-time thing, I can call somebody, I say, hey, we're meeting at this time, we're going to this place. And after that, no one cares anymore. If there's stuff that I might want to go back to and find it, but it's not critical, I might want to put that in a text message, because at least I can go back and search my text messages and find it again. If I'm conveying really important information, I want to put that in an email, because I can put it in a folder in my Outlook folder, so I can search it more easily. It becomes more persistent. So the persistence of communication becomes important to determine the means in which you're going to communicate that information. And the more important it is, the more persistent it becomes. The more persistent it becomes, the more you have to be able to find it again at some point in time. How many times Dallas and I have talked about something and I said, did you tell me this? And he said, yeah, I texted you that. And I said, oh yeah, you did. And I got to go search through, a week and a half of text to find it. But if it had been an email, it would have probably been easier to find. So I think that's a really important thing too, is what am I communicating depends on how I'm going to do it.
I think these are awesome pieces of information, and I'm so grateful. I'm cognizant of time and we're running just a little bit over, so I'm going to move us just into the transition out. But thank you both for sharing your insight and for your willingness to support nonprofits beyond this, because I think that's where I know these days are going to be long and we're going to figure it out is how I feel about it. I just want to note, we have the Mission Capital resource page and the Mission Capital Facebook group as resources for our nonprofits. And everybody is welcome to share information, and we're just really a clearinghouse for getting that information out. We have one more member meetup for the month of May, supporting your team by centering equity. I think we started the conversation here about mental health and taking care of your employees. So we'll really kind of dig into that. How do we make sure we're taking care of everybody? Not just the ones who are noisy or loud, but making sure that we're making space for everyone. And then today was announced also some free coaching sessions from ICF in the member update. If you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. But we also want to say we're here, membership at Mission Capital, events at Mission Capital. We are excited to hear from you. And I always like to say I don't have the answer usually on me, but I'm working on I'm happy to find that information for you. So once again, I just want to thank Dallas and Mike, and so grateful that you guys take the time to be with us today, and that take the time to share with our nonprofit sector. I know this conversation will be ongoing for sure as we find new challenges and new ways to adjust. I'm putting in the chat, and I'll send in a follow-up email, a survey and evaluation form. If you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear what's important to you, what's helpful, what's not. And we're grateful for y'all joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mission Capital.
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah. Stay safe out there.